The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a crimson glow over the small, isolated compound hidden deep in the woods. It looked like an ordinary place at first glance, a secluded patch of land far from the noise of the world, where the only sounds that seemed to exist were the whispers of nature. But beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful location, a storm was brewing, one that would forever change the lives of those who were drawn to it. The compound had once been the epicenter of something much darker, something that people were willing to die for, follow blindly, and give up everything for. And then it disappeared. The charismatic leader who had built it from the ground up vanished into thin air, leaving behind only traces of their influence. No one saw it coming. One day the leader, whose name had become synonymous with power, control, and mystique, was simply gone. There were no traces, no signs of struggle. It was as if they had vanished into the ether, leaving behind a legacy that would haunt anyone who came into contact with it. The world was left with a single question that no one could answer. What happened to them? The cult, which had been growing in influence for years, was suddenly left without direction. For many, the leader was not just a guide. They were a god, the central figure of their lives, the one who provided meaning, purpose, and above all, control. Without them, the followers were lost, adrift in a world that suddenly seemed much more uncertain, much more dangerous. In the wake of their disappearance, the followers were left to wonder, was the leader's absence truly a disappearance, or was it something more calculated? Did they leave on their own, or was something more sinister at play? The authorities, of course, had their suspicions. The leader's disappearance wasn't just the sudden vanishing of a figurehead, it was the unraveling of something much larger, something that went beyond the bounds of conventional understanding. The compound was raided, records were seized, and interviews were conducted. But the more they dug, the more elusive the answers became. It was as though the deeper they searched, the less they understood. For every clue they uncovered, two more seemed to slip away. Yet the story didn't end there. What followed was something that no one could have predicted. The rituals, the strange ceremonies that had been the hallmark of the cult's existence, didn't stop. They only grew in intensity. They became more secretive, more insular, almost like a shadow of the once dominant force they had been. And the strangest part was that these rituals weren't just for the true believers. They were for anyone who stumbled upon them, those who dared to venture too close to the darkness that had once been neatly contained within the walls of the compound. As the months passed, people began to speak of strange happenings, disappearances, unexplained deaths, and eerie symbols carved into trees and etched into walls. People began to wonder if the leader's disappearance had been a ruse, a well-calculated plan to make the world forget, only to resurface later when the time was right. But no one knew for sure. The leader was gone, and yet the rituals continued. The influence continued. The darkness remained. There were whispers, too, of those who had once been part of the group. Some of them had left, some had been forced out, but all had been affected in ways they could hardly explain. The leader had known them in ways no one else did, had known their deepest fears, their darkest desires, and used that knowledge to control them. For those who had been part of it all, the memories were haunting, the lessons learned through fear and devotion. And now, those who had left or escaped found themselves drawn back in by an invisible thread, pulled toward the remnants of the thing they thought they had left behind. What had happened to the leader? That was the question that gnawed at everyone's mind. Was it possible that the leader had staged their own disappearance to take on a new identity? Had they faked their death, vanished into the world to continue their work from the shadows? Or was something more nefarious at play? Had the leader really left, or had they been taken, killed, or even worse, manipulated into playing a different role in the shadows of a world that didn't understand? In the days that followed, the cult's former members scattered like pieces of a shattered mirror. Some sought help, some tried to forget, and others simply disappeared as though they had never existed in the first place. But the question still loomed large. What was happening now? Could anyone truly escape the grasp of the leader's influence, or were they destined to be dragged back into the abyss that had claimed so many others? The authorities seemed at a loss. They had no answers, no clear direction. They were working with a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve, the pieces slipping through their fingers every time they thought they had a lead. And then there were the survivors, the ones who had been there from the beginning, the ones who had seen it all. But they weren't talking. Some were too afraid, others too traumatized, and some had simply forgotten what it was like to live without the leader's presence. For them, the world had become one where every shadow could hide a secret, and every sound could mean danger. As the years passed, the mystery of the leader's disappearance only deepened. The cult, though scattered and fragmented, continued to influence events in ways that no one could explain. There were always whispers, always rumors, sightings of the leader here, strange messages left in obscure places there. But nothing concrete. No evidence. No proof. And yet, despite the passage of time, there was still a feeling that something was out of place, that something had been left unfinished, a story that had not yet reached its end. The cult leader's disappearance had become a riddle wrapped in an enigma, one that no one seemed able to solve. But the rituals, the influence, the darkness, they never truly stopped. They simply adapted, waiting for the right moment to rise again. What had happened to the leader? The question still hung in the air, unanswered. But the truth was far more chilling than anyone could have imagined. The leader's disappearance wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something much, much worse. And as the shadows grew longer and the whispers grew louder, the only thing certain was that the rituals, their power, their pull, would never truly fade. For years, the compound had been a place of refuge, a sanctuary of sorts for those who found themselves lost, disconnected from the world. People from all walks of life had been drawn to it, lonely souls, broken spirits, and those searching for meaning. What they found was a leader, a figure of almost mythic proportions, someone who seemed to know them better than they knew themselves. This leader had a way of speaking, a way of looking at you, that made you feel like you were the most important person in the world. It was this magnetism, this undeniable charm, that brought people to the compound in droves. But the leader's true power lay not in what they said, but in what they could make others believe. They preyed on vulnerability, on the cracks in the psyche of those who had nowhere else to turn. And for these people, the cult became their family, their salvation. They didn't just follow the leader, they worshipped them. The leader's words became gospel, their decisions law. Everything they said, everything they did, was taken as truth without question. It was as if the leader had the ability to reach inside each person's mind and weave a narrative that made them feel whole again, even as it slowly pulled them deeper into the cult's grasp. What made the leader so effective was their ability to convince others that they were part of something greater, something transcendent. They weren't just members of a group, they were chosen, selected for something extraordinary. The leader promised them power, fulfillment, and a sense of belonging they could never find anywhere else. And for many, it was a promise they believed with every fiber of their being. The rituals, the long drawn-out ceremonies held under the cover of night, became a key part of the cult's identity. The leader's followers took them very seriously. These weren't just symbolic acts, they were sacred. The rituals were meant to transcend the mundane, to connect the physical with the spiritual, to awaken something inside each person that they didn't even know existed. They were about purification, transformation. And when you believed that this leader had the ability to guide you through these rituals, to show you the path to a higher state of being, it was impossible to question the process. You just did it over and over without ever asking why. There were those who joined for the promise of peace, for the hope of finally finding inner calm. Others sought belonging in a world that made them feel invisible, overlooked. For some, the leader became a father figure, a mother figure, someone who could give them the guidance they never received. It was a dangerous dynamic, one that preyed on the emotional needs of each individual. The leader's every word became a beacon, their every action a sign of divine intervention. But it was all carefully orchestrated. Every ritual, every gathering was designed to reinforce the leader's control, to bind the followers to them and to each other. It was an intricate web, one that seemed impossible to escape once you were caught in it. At first, everything seemed innocent enough. The ceremonies were nothing more than quiet, introspective gatherings, where members sat in a circle, listening to the leader's soothing voice as they spoke of higher truths and divine purposes. But over time things changed. The rituals grew darker, more intense. They became less about spiritual awakening and more about control, about submission. The members, once content to follow the leader's teachings, began to lose themselves in the rituals. They became consumed by them. Some would even say that the leader's eyes, when they locked onto you during these ceremonies, seemed to see straight through you, that they could peer into your very soul. And with that gaze came an almost magnetic pull, one that drew you deeper into the web they had spun. The rituals began to take on a life of their own. New ones were introduced, each more disturbing than the last. In the beginning they were simple, a chant, a prayer, a symbolic act of unity. But soon there were symbols, strange cryptic marks that appeared in the woods surrounding the compound, carved into the trees, drawn into the dirt. And with these symbols came the whispers. Whispers about the leader's true intentions, about the nature of the rituals, about what they were really meant to accomplish. But no one dared to ask questions. To do so was to risk being cast out, to risk losing everything they had come to believe in. The followers, intoxicated by their devotion, continued to submit to the leader's will. They didn't see the manipulation, the subtle coercion that was taking place. They only saw the leader as a guiding light, someone who had answers to questions they had never known to ask. The rituals weren't just an obligation, they were a necessity. They were the key to salvation, to enlightenment, to becoming something more than what they were. And for many, this promise was enough to blind them to the dangers that lurked just beneath the surface. And then the leader vanished. One day, without warning, they were gone. No explanation, no sign of what had happened, just an eerie silence that hung over the compound. The followers at first were in shock. The person who had given their lives meaning, who had made them feel special, was no longer there. But despite the vacuum created by their disappearance, the rituals didn't stop. They continued, only now they had taken on an even more sinister tone. The sense of loss only amplified the intensity of the ceremonies. It was as if the leader's absence had created a void, one that could only be filled by a more extreme commitment to the cause. Some followers tried to leave, to return to their old lives. But they found that they couldn't. The hold the leader had over them wasn't just psychological, it was spiritual, emotional, something that reached into the deepest parts of their being. For those who tried to walk away, the rituals came calling once again, beckoning them back to the compound, to the life they had known. But for those who had left, it was never the same. They were haunted by the leader's absence, by the belief that somehow, they were still connected to the cult, to the rituals that had once been their lifeline. It was a pull that they couldn't resist, no matter how hard they tried. The remaining followers, those who had stayed behind, began to turn on each other. They too felt the loss. Without the leader to guide them, the unity that had once bound them together began to unravel. Suspicion grew. Who was leading the rituals now? Was it someone chosen by the leader, or was it just a continuation of their original teachings? Could anyone truly take the leader's place, or was this all an elaborate farce designed to keep the followers bound in a perpetual state of dependence? And yet, despite the confusion, despite the tension, the rituals continued. The belief in the leader, in the teachings, in the power of the ceremonies, remained steadfast. It was as if the leader's absence had made them more desperate, more devoted to the idea that they could never escape. The ritualistic cycles became more frequent, more intense, as if to compensate for the missing presence that had once given them structure. As the years passed, the stories began to change. Whispers of the leader's return spread through the compound, fueled by those who believed that the disappearance had been a test, a trial of faith. Others, more skeptical, spoke of a new figure taking the leader's place, one who operated in the shadows, manipulating the followers from behind the scenes. But no one truly knew the truth. They only knew that the rituals hadn't stopped. And that, in itself, was a terrifying thought, because if the leader had truly gone, why hadn't they taken the rituals with them? What was left now was a cult that had outlived its creator, a dark force that refused to die. And so, the cycle continued. Those who had once been blind followers, completely devoted to the leader, found themselves still tethered to the compound, still bound by the rituals that had come to define their lives. They didn't know where the leader had gone, or why they had disappeared. But one thing was certain. The rituals, the power, the influence, never truly stopped. They simply adapted, evolved, and found new ways to lure in those who were still searching for something greater. And in this ever-shifting game of belief, the line between devotion and madness had blurred forever. Months had passed since the leader's disappearance, and yet the compound that once pulsed with life seemed as though it had not been abandoned at all. From the outside, it looked like a ghost town, empty, silent, as if the people who once occupied it had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but a shell. But beneath this eerie exterior, something was stirring. The rituals, the quiet but insistent ceremonies that had been so much a part of the cult's identity, had not ceased. They were still happening, but now, in the shadows, away from the prying eyes of the world. No longer were they conducted under the leader's watchful eye. Instead, they had become something darker, more dangerous. The absence of the leader had only shifted the balance, giving birth to a new, more insidious kind of power. Those who had remained, those who hadn't been able to escape or perhaps had simply not wanted to, still believed in the sanctity of the rituals. They were the true believers, the ones who could not imagine life without the purpose the leader had given them. But the absence of the leader had left them without direction, without clarity. And so, the rituals had become more erratic, more desperate, as though the followers were trying to recapture something that had been lost. In their attempts to keep the spirit of the cult alive, they found themselves performing the same acts, but with less precision, less meaning. It was as though they were stumbling through the motions, hoping that by doing so, they could bring back the magic that once seemed to flow so effortlessly through their lives. The authorities at first had been quick to dismiss the strange happenings around the compound. They were convinced that the cult was a thing of the past, that its disappearance had been simply the result of a charismatic leader losing their hold over a fragile group of followers. But as the months wore on, they began to notice something unsettling. There were rumors, whispers of people being seen entering the compound late at night, of strange lights flickering in the distance, of figures moving in and out of the trees. The rituals, once thought to be dead and buried, had never truly stopped. Instead, they had adapted, evolved, finding new ways to remain in the dark corners of the world. Some of the original followers had tried to move on. They had left the compound, left the community, convinced that they had escaped the grasp of the cult and its leader. But the hold, as it turned out, wasn't so easily broken. For those who had spent years under the leader's influence, it wasn't as simple as walking away. The rituals, the teachings, they had been woven into the very fabric of their identities. And now that the leader was gone, these remnants of the past still haunted them. They couldn't escape the feeling that they were being pulled back, that they were somehow still tethered to the compound, to the darkness, to the rituals they had once participated in. Even those who had tried to move on found themselves drawn back to the cult's old ways, unable to shake the feeling that they had missed something, that there was still more to be revealed. The first signs of trouble came when a few of the former members began to speak out. At first, they were hesitant, unsure of what they had experienced, unsure if they could trust their own memories. But slowly as time passed, the stories began to pour out, stories of strange occurrences that couldn't be explained, of unsettling dreams and inexplicable feelings of dread. Some of them spoke of feeling watched, of hearing voices in the dead of night, of seeing shadows that didn't belong. Others claimed they had felt a strange pull, a compulsion to return to the compound, to join the rituals once again. For the authorities, these accounts were hard to ignore. They had dismissed the cult as a mere curiosity, a relic of a bygone era. But now, with these reports surfacing, they couldn't help but wonder. Was there something more to this than they had initially thought? Could the rituals have continued in secret, beyond the scope of their investigation? And if so, what had become of the leader? Had they left behind some kind of hidden influence, some power that continued to control those who had once followed them? As the investigation deepened, the authorities began to look at the compound again, hoping to find something they had missed the first time around. But when they arrived, there was nothing there, nothing that could be easily explained. The buildings were still standing, the trees still rustled in the wind, but there were no signs of life. No evidence of the rituals. No sign of the people who had once called the compound home. It was as though the place itself had swallowed them whole, hiding them away from the world. But even as the authorities combed through the compound, evidence of the ongoing rituals began to surface in unexpected places. It wasn't just the occasional whispered rumor or unsettling tale. There were tangible, physical signs, strange symbols etched into the trees, unfamiliar markings on the ground, and the occasional object left behind in the woods, a broken piece of pottery, a discarded cloth stained with something dark. These were things that couldn't be ignored. They were fragments of a life that had once been lived here, a life that had not disappeared as completely as everyone had assumed. The more they investigated, the more they began to realize that something was terribly wrong. The rituals hadn't just continued, they had evolved. What had once been a series of sacred acts, carefully controlled and deeply meaningful, had now become twisted, distorted. They were darker now, less about spiritual enlightenment and more about something else, something much more sinister. The followers who remained had changed. They were no longer the devoted believers they had once been. They had become something else entirely, people obsessed with power, with control, with maintaining the rituals at all costs. And in this new version of the cult, there was no room for doubt, no room for questioning. Those who had managed to leave the compound, those who had escaped the leader's influence, found themselves being drawn back in. It wasn't that they wanted to return, it was that something in them, some part of their psyche, still longed for the rituals, still craved the feeling of belonging that had once come with them. It wasn't just the pull of the leader anymore, it was the pull of the cult itself, a force that had grown beyond the leader's original intentions, a force that had become self-sustaining, impossible to break. The members of the cult, once so dependent on the leader, had now become their own driving force. One of the most troubling aspects of the cult's survival was the way it continued to exert influence over the lives of those who had left. Some of these former members, now struggling to live normal lives, spoke of constant feelings of paranoia, of being watched. Others reported hearing strange whispers in their ears at night, voices that seemed to come from nowhere, calling them back to the compound, urging them to rejoin the rituals. And then there were the dreams, terrifying, vivid dreams that felt more like memories than mere figments of the imagination. In these dreams, the leader was always there, watching, guiding, manipulating them into returning to the fold. But what were the true motivations behind these rituals now? Why had they not stopped with the leader's disappearance? What was the purpose of these secret gatherings, of the dark, cryptic symbols and strange occurrences that seemed to defy explanation? The authorities were no closer to finding out. The answers were elusive, slipping through their fingers like smoke. What they did know was that the rituals were not just a relic of the past. They were a living, breathing entity that had taken on a life of its own. And no matter how much they tried to dismantle it, no matter how many followers they rescued or exposed, the rituals would not die. The question now was whether anyone would ever be able to stop them, or whether the cult's influence would continue to haunt the world in secret, waiting for the right moment to strike again. As the investigation stalled, the people who had once been caught in the web of the cult remained trapped, still haunted by the leader's absence, still drawn to the rituals that had become their entire reality. And in the silence that followed, one thing was certain: the story of the cult was far from over. It was only just beginning. The mystery of the cult had deepened into something much darker than anyone had anticipated. What had once seemed like a straightforward case, a leader who had vanished and left behind a group of disillusioned followers, had grown into a labyrinth of lies, secrets, and rituals that seemed to defy all logic. The authorities, once so sure of their investigation, now found themselves at a crossroads. They had done their best to piece together the scattered fragments of the cult's history, to uncover the truth behind the leader's disappearance. But with each new revelation, they found themselves digging deeper into a hole that only seemed to grow darker and more dangerous. The first real breakthrough came when an investigative journalist named Sophie Redding was assigned to look into the case. Sophie was no stranger to controversial stories, having worked on everything from organized crime to political corruption. But something about this case felt different. The more she delved into the details, the more she realized that there was something much more insidious at play. The leader's disappearance was only the surface of a much deeper, much more sinister mystery. And the followers who had been left behind were not the broken, lost individuals they appeared to be. They were survivors, yes, but they were also still deeply influenced by the rituals, by the unshakable belief that something greater was at work. Sophie's first interviews with former cult members were chilling. These individuals, who had once been part of the tight-knit community, spoke of a profound connection to the leader, a connection that seemed to transcend reason. They spoke of the rituals, the sacred ceremonies that had been the backbone of the cult's existence, and how these ceremonies had continued after the leader's disappearance. But what they described was not just a continuation of the practices, it was an evolution. The rituals had become darker, more dangerous. They no longer sought spiritual enlightenment. Instead, they had turned into something else, something that centered around power, control, and an ever-growing need for more. The leader's absence had created a void, and into that void had poured something far more destructive than anyone had imagined. As Sophie spoke to more former members, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The survivors who had left the cult still felt the pull of the rituals, the need to participate in them. Many spoke of how their lives had never truly returned to normal after leaving the compound. The psychological hold the leader had on them was still present, even though the leader was gone. Sophie learned that, for many, leaving wasn't a simple matter of walking away. It was as if the very core of their identities had been shaped by the cult's teachings, and without those teachings they felt lost, unmoored. The rituals, for some, had become a lifeline, a way to reconnect to the sense of purpose and meaning they had once felt. But for others, the rituals were a haunting reminder of the horrors they had endured, a constant source of anxiety and fear. Even though they had tried to escape, they found themselves drawn back to the compound again and again, unable to resist the pull of what they had once believed in so wholeheartedly. Sophie's investigation took her deeper into the remnants of the cult. She spoke to law enforcement officials who had worked on the case, many of whom were as baffled as she was by the continued existence of the cult. Some believed that the leader's disappearance had been a carefully planned ruse, a way to throw off the authorities and allow the cult to continue operating in secret. Others thought that the leader had simply vanished, leaving behind a shell of a group that would eventually collapse under its own weight. But the more Sophie uncovered, the more it became clear that the truth was far more complicated. She discovered that the cult had always operated in secrecy, using a web of interconnected relationships and hidden channels to maintain its influence. Even after the leader's disappearance, these networks remained intact, providing a lifeline for those who still believed in the cause. The rituals, once thought to be relics of a bygone era, had never truly stopped. They had simply gone underground, taking on new forms, adapting to the changing world around them. Sophie began to piece together the evidence, slowly but surely, until she had enough to confirm what she had feared. The cult was far from over. In fact, it had never really gone away. The investigation revealed that the cult had established secret groups and cells that operated outside of the public eye. These cells continued to hold rituals, to perform the dark ceremonies that had once been a hallmark of the cult's identity. But the rituals were not just about spirituality anymore. They had become a way to maintain control, a method of ensuring that the followers remained loyal to the cause. The leader's disappearance had only strengthened their belief in the rituals, making them more desperate to continue the work that had been started. The followers who remained, those who hadn't been disillusioned or frightened away, were now more fervently devoted to the cause than ever before. One of the most chilling aspects of the investigation was the discovery of a new leader, or at least, someone who was assuming the role of the leader in the absence of the original figurehead. Sophie uncovered evidence that a select group of high-ranking members had taken it upon themselves to continue the cult's mission. This new leader was not the same as the charismatic figure who had originally founded the cult, but they were still deeply influential. They had taken the teachings of the original leader and twisted them into something more dark and insidious. The rituals had evolved, and now they were not just about spiritual awakening, they were about control, about keeping the followers locked in a perpetual cycle of obedience and fear. As Sophie dug deeper into the story, she began to realize that the cult's influence had spread far beyond the compound. It had infiltrated local communities, weaving itself into the fabric of society in ways that were almost invisible. The rituals had become a part of everyday life for those still caught in the cult's web. And for those who had left, the influence remained. They were still haunted by the leader's teachings, still drawn to the rituals, still fighting against the powerful psychological grip the cult had on them. Sophie could see that the story was far from over. The truth, as it turned out, was much darker than anyone had imagined. But the investigation was not without its dangers. As Sophie continued to uncover the truth, she received threats. Her life was no longer her own. The cult, or whatever had replaced it, was still watching, still pulling the strings. There were moments when Sophie began to feel like she was in over her head, like she was being pulled into a web that she couldn't escape. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that the cult's influence had grown beyond the physical realm. It had become an invisible force, one that shaped the lives of those who had been part of it in ways they could no longer comprehend. Sophie found herself becoming obsessed with the case, unable to walk away from it, even as it began to consume her. She began to understand, on a deeply personal level, the psychological hold the cult had on its followers. She understood the allure, the promise of something greater, the sense of purpose that had drawn so many into the cult's grasp. And as she continued her investigation, she realized that the real danger of the cult was not in the rituals themselves, but in the way they preyed on the human need for belonging, for meaning, for a sense of control. It was this, more than anything else, that had allowed the cult to survive, to evolve, and to continue long after the leader had disappeared. The investigation had become something much more than just a story. It had become a battle for understanding, for unraveling the truth, and for finding a way to stop the cult from spreading any further. But Sophie was no longer just a journalist. She was a part of the story now. She was entangled in the web of the cult, and as much as she tried to stay detached, she couldn't help but feel the pull of the darkness that had once consumed so many. The truth was out there, but it was more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And as Sophie pressed forward, one thing became clear. The cult's hold on its followers, on its victims, was far from broken. It was only just beginning. As Sophie continued to dig deeper into the case, the chilling reality of what she was uncovering began to take shape in a way that was almost too horrific to fully comprehend. The cult was not simply some long-forgotten relic of a bygone era. It was still very much alive. But more than that, it was growing in ways that no one had expected. The leader's absence had not led to a breakdown of the group. Instead, it had birthed a far more insidious version of the cult, one that was operating in the shadows, hidden from the authorities in the outside world. The rituals, once thought to be a relic of the past, were not only still ongoing, they had become darker, more violent, and more insular. Sophie had come to a terrifying realization. The cult had never truly stopped. Its followers, those who had once sworn allegiance to the leader, had simply adapted. They had learned to survive without the charismatic figurehead, but in doing so, they had also learned to become more secretive, more dangerous. The rituals, once a way of seeking spiritual enlightenment, had evolved into something far more sinister. They were no longer about ascension or enlightenment, they had become about power, control, and the manipulation of those who remained in the fold. It was as though the rituals themselves had taken on a life of their own, driven by a force that was now beyond the control of any single individual. The more Sophie uncovered, the more she began to understand the true scope of the cult's influence. It wasn't just about the group that had remained at the compound. The influence had spread, like a slow-growing infection, into the surrounding community. It had permeated society in ways that no one could fully grasp. People who had never even been to the compound found themselves touched by the cult's reach. Some were involved directly, having been recruited into the fold under the guise of seeking spiritual awakening. Others were affected in subtler ways, through subtle manipulations, strange coincidences, and the quiet pressure that came from being in the orbit of those who had once been cult members. The cult had woven itself into the fabric of the community, and it was impossible to tell who had been touched by its influence and who had remained unaffected. One of the most disturbing discoveries Sophie made was that the rituals had not only continued, they had become more intricate, more elaborate, and more insistent. There were reports of strange gatherings in the dead of night, meetings that took place in remote locations, far from the prying eyes of the outside world. People spoke of seeing figures cloaked in black, moving through the woods surrounding the compound. And in the center of these rituals, there were whispers of a new leader, a shadowy figure who had emerged from the remnants of the original cult, someone who was now guiding the followers with an iron grip. At first, Sophie found it hard to believe. How could someone take on the mantle of leadership when the original figurehead had disappeared without a trace? How could the followers have allowed themselves to be led again by someone they had never even seen? But the more she learned, the more it became clear that the leader's disappearance had only been a ruse, a carefully orchestrated plan designed to throw the authorities off the scent. The leader hadn't simply vanished, they had made their exit with purpose. And in doing so, they had set in motion a chain of events that would ensure the cult's survival, no matter what. The new leader, it seemed, was not someone who had stepped forward with the same kind of charismatic presence as the original leader. This new figure was more subtle, more strategic. They operated from the shadows, pulling the strings of the remaining cult members, manipulating them with a quiet, insidious power. The new leader's influence was felt in ways that were almost imperceptible at first. They didn't make grand speeches or declarations. They worked through whispers, through half-formed thoughts, through a deep-seated sense of fear that permeated the cult's remaining members. The rituals that had once been about spiritual enlightenment had now become something else entirely. They were about control, about maintaining power over those who still believed in the cause. And the followers, many of whom had been raised on the teachings of the original leader, were now trapped in a cycle of obedience, their every move dictated by the rituals that had once given their lives meaning. The leader's teachings had been twisted into a dark parody of what they had originally intended. What had once been about self-discovery and transcendence had become about submission and fear. As Sophie continued to uncover the layers of this dark reality, she began to piece together the events that had led to this point. The disappearance of the leader had been part of a larger plan, one that had been carefully laid out in advance. The leader had known that their time was running out, that their influence would one day wane. But instead of allowing the cult to dissolve into obscurity, they had orchestrated their own disappearance. They had made it appear as though they had vanished, but in truth, they had simply retreated into the shadows, allowing the cult to continue its work without them. The new leader had been chosen carefully, someone who was able to pick up where the original leader had left off, but with a much more subtle approach. This new leader was not interested in the same grandiose displays of power that the original leader had been known for. Instead, they preferred to work quietly behind the scenes, manipulating the remaining followers and ensuring that the rituals continued unabated. They were a master of psychological manipulation, using fear and uncertainty to keep the followers in line, convincing them that the rituals were not just necessary but vital for their survival. What Sophie realized with growing horror was that the cult had become self-sustaining. It no longer needed the original leader to survive. The rituals, the power, the control, it had all become part of the cult's DNA. Even without the figurehead of the leader, the cult had found a way to continue, to thrive, to adapt. And the most terrifying part was that there seemed to be no end in sight. The followers, those who had remained, had become so deeply entrenched in the rituals that they were willing to do anything to keep them going. The cycle of obedience and submission had become ingrained in their very identities. Sophie's investigation began to take its toll on her. The deeper she dug, the more she began to feel the same psychological pull that the cult had exerted on its followers. She found herself constantly thinking about the rituals, about the leader, about the hold that this dark force had over the people who had once been part of it. It was as if she were being drawn into the very thing she was trying to expose. She began to question her own motivations, her own beliefs. Was she just like them? Was she becoming a part of this cycle too? The thought terrified her. But Sophie pressed on, driven by the need to uncover the truth. The investigation had become something personal now, something that she could not walk away from, no matter how much she wanted to. She knew that the cult's influence was still out there, still growing, still reaching into the lives of people who had no idea what they were walking into. And if she didn't continue, if she didn't expose the truth, the cult would continue to thrive, to manipulate, to control. As Sophie's investigation neared its peak, the stakes grew higher. She knew that the cult would do anything to protect itself, to keep its secrets buried. She had already received threats, warnings to stop digging, to leave the story alone. But Sophie was determined. She knew that the truth had to come out no matter the cost. The cult had to be stopped before it consumed even more lives, before its insidious influence spread even further. But the more she uncovered, the more she realized that this wasn't just a battle to expose the cult, it was a battle for her own soul, her own sense of self. And with every new revelation, it became harder to tell where the investigation ended and the cult's hold on her began. The line between the cult and the world outside had blurred, and Sophie knew that she couldn't escape the web that had been spun. The only question now was whether she could expose the truth before it was too late. As Sophie's investigation continued, the deeper she ventured into the labyrinth of secrets surrounding the cult, the more she realized just how tightly its influence had woven itself into the very fabric of society. It wasn't just a distant, isolated phenomenon confined to the compound, it had extended its tendrils far beyond its original walls. The cult's grip on its members was as potent as ever, and now, its influence had spread to unsuspecting communities. Sophie's determination to uncover the truth had transformed from a journalistic quest into a personal battle, one that felt increasingly like a descent into darkness. The sense of paranoia that had begun to settle over her was almost unbearable. Sophie had always prided herself on her objectivity and ability to stay detached from the stories she covered, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that the cult was always watching her. Every rustle of leaves, every unfamiliar face she saw on the street, every car that seemed to be following her, it was all a sign, or so she told herself, that she was being watched. The more she uncovered, the more it seemed as though the cult's presence was everywhere, like an unseen shadow following her every move. But it wasn't just paranoia. Sophie had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and they were telling her that something far more insidious was at play. The cult had become a self-sustaining force, a machine that operated on its own, without the need for the original leader. The influence had spread not only through the remaining members but also through those who had once been part of the group. These people, some of whom had been part of the cult for years, were still caught in the web despite leaving the compound behind. They were being pulled back over and over again by the very rituals that had once controlled them. Sophie's interviews with former cult members had become more intense, more unsettling. They spoke of a strange compulsion, a feeling that they could never truly escape the influence of the cult. It was as though the rituals had become so deeply ingrained in their minds that they could no longer tell where their own thoughts ended and the cult's teachings began. Some spoke of feeling haunted by dreams, others by whispers they could never quite make out. But the most disturbing part was that the rituals, those same ceremonies that had been so tightly controlled and orchestrated by the leader, had not disappeared. They had morphed into something new, something darker. The rituals were no longer about spiritual growth or enlightenment. They had become about something far more primal: power, control, and the manipulation of the followers' deepest fears and desires. Those who remained in the cult spoke of the rituals with an almost reverent tone, as though they were not just acts of faith but acts of survival. These ceremonies were now about proving loyalty, about reaffirming one's place within the cult's hierarchy, about maintaining the fragile semblance of control over an uncontrollable world. The cult had found a way to adapt to the changing world, and its methods were becoming more sophisticated, more dangerous. Sophie's investigation led her to uncover something truly chilling. There were rumors that the new leader, the shadowy figure who had taken over after the original leader's disappearance, was not simply guiding the rituals from afar. There were whispers that this new leader was somehow involved in more than just spiritual manipulation. Some former members had claimed that the rituals had taken on a violent edge, that they were no longer merely symbolic but had become acts of aggression and submission. These acts were not only psychological, they were physical. The rituals were now accompanied by rituals of pain, both physical and emotional. The followers, desperate to maintain their place in the cult's hierarchy, would subject themselves to painful ordeals, all in the name of devotion. The new leader had made the rituals not only a means of control but also a way to demonstrate power. The followers who were still part of the group were expected to participate in these violent acts that would prove their loyalty, their devotion, and their ability to endure. It was a twisted form of sacrifice, one that left scars on both the body and the soul. The new leader understood that in order to maintain control, they had to make the followers feel as though they were trapped, both physically and psychologically. The more they endured, the more they believed that they were part of something bigger, something greater than themselves. But in reality they were being broken down, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of their former selves. Sophie was disturbed by these revelations. The cult's transformation into something more violent, more insidious, only confirmed her fears that the cult was no longer just a matter of misplaced faith or misguided belief. It was a dangerous, thriving entity, and it was more powerful than anyone had realized. Sophie could no longer look at the cult as simply a story. She had become a part of it whether she liked it or not. And now the cult's grip on her was growing tighter with every passing day. Sophie began to feel that the lines between the investigation and the cult were becoming blurred. She had started this investigation with the belief that she could expose the truth, that she could unravel the mysteries of the cult and bring it to light. But now, as she delved deeper into its inner workings, she began to feel as though the cult was slowly pulling her in. It was not just the fear of being watched, of being followed. It was the slow, creeping feeling that she was becoming a part of the story, that the darkness she was investigating was now inextricably tied to her own life. The more she uncovered, the more Sophie began to question her own motivations. She was no longer just an observer, she was a participant in some way. The cult had a way of drawing people in, making them believe that they were part of something important, something bigger than themselves. And Sophie could feel that same lure, that same pull beginning to affect her. The investigation had become her obsession. She couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop wondering what lay behind the next door, the next hidden secret. She was being consumed by the very thing she had set out to expose. As her sense of isolation grew, Sophie began to notice something even more disturbing. The former members of the cult she had interviewed seemed to know more than they were letting on. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting around nervously, as though they were afraid of being overheard. But it wasn't just fear, it was something else. There was a certain reverence in their words, an acknowledgment of the power that the cult still held over them. And then there were the warnings. Some of them told Sophie to stop, to turn back before it was too late. Others spoke cryptically of the consequences of getting too close, of the things that would happen if she continued her search for the truth. The more Sophie uncovered, the more she realized how deeply the cult had infiltrated the lives of its followers. It wasn't just the rituals that had continued, it was the very essence of the cult that had persisted. The followers didn't just believe in the leader, they believed in the cult itself, in the power it held over their lives. They had internalized the teachings, the rituals, and the manipulations to such a degree that they could no longer distinguish between their own identities and the identities that had been imposed on them by the cult. Sophie's investigation had begun to feel like an unraveling thread, one that she could no longer control. She had set out to expose the cult, to uncover the truth behind its continued existence. But now, it seemed as though the cult had already found a way to infiltrate her mind, to make her question everything she thought she knew. The line between truth and deception had become increasingly difficult to see. Sophie had started out as a reporter, but now she was no longer sure of her own role in the story. The deeper she went, the more she understood. The cult wasn't just a threat to those who still believed in it. It was a threat to anyone who came into contact with it, even indirectly. The cult's influence didn't stop with its members. It reached into the world beyond, pulling others in, manipulating them, until they too became trapped in its web. Sophie was now part of that web, and there was no telling how far the cult's reach would extend, or whether she could ever escape its grasp. The truth was out there, but with every new piece of information Sophie uncovered, she was starting to wonder if it was a truth she was ready to face. Sophie's obsession with the cult had reached a point where she could no longer tell where the investigation ended and her own descent into madness began. The more she uncovered, the deeper the mystery seemed to stretch, like an endless labyrinth. Each door she opened revealed another layer of deception, another shadowy figure, another ritual. And yet, despite everything she had learned, despite all the evidence she had gathered, Sophie still felt as if she were no closer to the truth. If anything, the cult seemed more impenetrable, more elusive than ever before. It was as though the truth was deliberately being hidden from her, just beyond her reach, and the closer she got, the more the cult's influence began to warp her understanding of reality. She spent sleepless nights poring over her notes, sifting through the hundreds of hours of interviews she had conducted, trying to piece together the puzzle. But the more she tried to make sense of it all, the more she found herself lost in a haze of confusion. The former cult members she had spoken to seemed to offer conflicting accounts, and the deeper she dug, the more fragmented their stories became. Some described the rituals in excruciating detail, recounting every movement, every chant, as though they were reliving the experience in real time. Others seemed terrified to even speak of it, as if the very mention of the rituals triggered some kind of psychic wound they were desperate to forget. Some claimed the rituals had been harmless, even beneficial at one point, while others spoke of violent acts, blood sacrifices, and twisted forms of worship. Sophie could no longer tell if these varying accounts were the result of trauma, manipulation, or if the cult itself had evolved into something far darker than anyone had imagined. What had started as a story about a charismatic leader and their band of followers had become an overwhelming narrative of psychological warfare, of people who had been broken down and rebuilt by the very force they had once trusted. The leader, now a shadow, was still the core of everything: the power, the control, the fear. But Sophie realized something else. It was not just the leader's teachings that had shaped the followers. It was something much more subtle and insidious. It was the rituals themselves, the repeated acts that had gradually taken hold of their minds, until they no longer had the strength or the will to break free. Sophie's understanding of the cult had shifted. It was no longer just an organization or a group of misguided individuals. It was a force, a system, a set of rituals that transcended individual leaders. These rituals had a life of their own, feeding on the minds of those who participated, twisting them into something unrecognizable. It wasn't just about belief anymore, it was about survival. The followers were no longer just worshippers. They were addicts, driven by a need to perform the rituals, to be part of something larger, to fulfill a psychological and spiritual hunger that could not be satiated. These rituals had become an insidious kind of drug, and the followers were trapped in a cycle of addiction, desperately searching for something they could never truly find. The cult's power, Sophie realized, was not just in its ability to control its members through fear or devotion. It was in its ability to make people question their very perception of reality. The longer Sophie stayed in the investigation, the more she began to feel the same sense of disorientation that so many of the former cult members had described. There were moments when she would find herself questioning her own memories, wondering if she had truly seen what she thought she had seen, if she could trust the things she had heard. It was as if the cult had planted seeds of doubt in her mind, just as it had done to those who had been consumed by it. In her pursuit of the truth, Sophie had inadvertently become a victim of the very thing she was trying to expose. She started to experience strange, unsettling phenomena. At first, it was small things: an unexplained chill in the air, the sound of whispers when no one was around, flashes of images in her peripheral vision that disappeared when she turned to look. Then it escalated. Sophie would wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, feeling like she was being watched. Sometimes she would hear faint chanting coming from somewhere in her apartment, even though she knew she was alone. When she closed her eyes, she saw symbols, strange, cryptic markings that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. She tried to tell herself that it was all a product of her overactive imagination, that the stress of the investigation was starting to take its toll. But deep down, Sophie knew something was wrong. She began to feel disconnected from reality, as though she were living in two worlds at once: the world she had once known and the world she was uncovering through the cult's influence. The lines between the two were becoming increasingly blurred. Sophie started to wonder if the cult's power was more than just psychological. Could there be something supernatural at play? Were the rituals somehow tapping into forces beyond the comprehension of ordinary people? The more she delved into the cult's history, the more she found references to strange, otherworldly forces, references that were vague but unmistakable. The leader, in particular, had spoken of a higher power, something that existed beyond the physical realm, something that could only be accessed through the rituals. Sophie's logical mind rebelled against the idea of the supernatural. She had always prided herself on being a skeptic, someone who relied on evidence and reason. But as the investigation deepened, she began to wonder if there was something more to the cult than anyone had realized. She had spoken to enough former members to know that the cult had been a place of intense psychological manipulation, but now she was starting to feel like there was something even darker at work. She wondered if the leader had known something the rest of the world didn't, if the cult's rituals had somehow unlocked a doorway to a reality that was both terrifying and incomprehensible. The more Sophie pondered these possibilities, the more she became convinced that the cult was no longer just a criminal organization or a religious group gone wrong. It was a force, a living entity that fed off fear, doubt, and devotion. And it was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Sophie's next breakthrough came when she discovered something in the cult's archives. Documents that had been hidden for years, guarded by the most trusted members. These documents, written by the leader themselves, contained references to a ritual so powerful that it was said to transcend time and space. The ritual, described in vague but chilling detail, was said to open a gateway to a place beyond the physical realm, a place where the leader believed true power resided. The followers who participated in the ritual were promised enlightenment, but at a cost. The documents didn't explain what the cost was, but Sophie didn't need to know. She could already sense that this ritual was at the heart of everything, the key to the cult's ability to control, to manipulate, to maintain its power. Sophie realized that she was getting closer to uncovering the final piece of the puzzle. But the closer she came to the truth, the more dangerous the investigation became. Her phone was tapped, her movements were being monitored, and her every interaction seemed to be scrutinized by someone, or something, lurking in the shadows. She was no longer just investigating the cult. She was now a part of its story, caught in its web, unable to escape. The ritual was calling her, just as it had called to so many others before her. Sophie was becoming the story, a new player in the cult's eternal cycle. Sophie's obsession was now all-consuming. She couldn't stop herself from diving deeper, even though she knew the danger was greater than ever. The truth was within her grasp, but it was also a truth that might destroy her. In the end, Sophie realized that the cult had already won, not just over the people who still believed but over her as well. She was no longer in control. The investigation, once a means to expose the truth, had become the very thing that threatened to consume her. Sophie's descent into the heart of the cult had become something more than just a journalistic pursuit. It was now a battle for her very sanity. Every lead she followed, every secret she unearthed, brought her closer to an undeniable truth. The cult had ensnared her, just as it had done to so many others before her. The deeper she ventured, the more she began to realize that she was no longer investigating the cult from the outside. She was caught in its web, and it was pulling her closer to its center, inch by inch. She couldn't escape the feeling that the cult's influence was not just psychological. It was almost metaphysical, a force beyond human comprehension. Sophie began to feel as if the very act of investigating the cult was causing her to slip further into its grip, as if every question she asked, every answer she uncovered, was a step closer to surrendering her mind to the same darkness that had overtaken the followers. She had once believed that uncovering the truth would set her free, but now she understood that the truth was a double-edged sword. It could either free her or consume her completely.